Hello and welcome to Worlds Unwritten, helping to write more immersive characters, settings, and stories for your tabletop games. My name is Jericho, and I will be your GM today. Today's topic is on creating a more immersive setting for your players to interact with, a sort of in-depth look at some of the campaign prep you can do to reduce the number of times you're having to stop the action and check your notes. As a GM myself, one of the biggest things I struggled with was presenting a scene for my players that really didn't feel real enough. It kind of felt bare bones, sort of like when you go into a large MMO city and there's only the important NPCs, there's no one really walking around. It doesn't feel like a lived in world. And creating that sort of experience in my tabletop games is something I've been chasing after for a long time, but really struggled with for a while to figure out. And I wanted to share today some of the solutions I've come up with in the years since I really started focusing on that problem. And a lot of it's going to boil down to just doing additional campaign prep. But that's really up to you how much you want to do. In my experience, though, after doing a bit of prep here and there when I have time, it's really made all of my games just so much better. So, what are some of the options I'm talking about? The really main tool that I've used is to have a backlog of names and descriptions that I can call on to help fill out my world. I think I speak for myself and a lot of other GMs and players when a favorite pastime of mine is just building characters. Uh, Writing down stats and everything, but also coming up with their name, description, and even a backstory for those characters is something I really enjoyed doing during my free time. I'm probably never going to play these characters, but using them to flesh out my world has become a way that I can run them, even if I'm just using the descriptions and names of the characters when I'm setting a scene. It makes the world feel that much more lived in. So, let's say your players are first arriving in this brand new city. You've taken a minute to describe what the city looks like, but something I always found I did when I described the city, I described this beautiful fountain in the center of the city, but I didn't describe any people around it. So, while it's implied that there's people there, that's not something that's directly being described, so it can be a bit of a disconnect for players. But when I can then describe it as, you know, as you enter the city, there is a couple market stalls you see, and you begin to hear an argument from a lizard folk with sickly green scales and a pair of blades at his side. Uh, you see him sort of arguing with a young human at the shop over the price of rations. Being able to add in little details like that just helps to flesh out the story and the world so much more. And so, having these sort of descriptions on hand, I like to have a Word document open on my computer when I'm running that just has a list of names and a list of character descriptions so that when I'm setting a scene, I can grab any of those when I need them. If your players are trying to gather information in a place they're new to, you can have the people they're talking to not just give them the points they're looking for, but also mention names. Uh, let's say your players go to the nearby wharf, speak to some fishermen, and they mention that it was Izik recently who went out into the woods and has been acting strangely ever since. But their compatriot turns to them, addresses them by name, and argues that it wasn't Izik who went out into the forest, it was Renauld. Izik just went to visit his family a couple weeks ago. You're thinking of the wrong person. And just by doing that, you can add in so much more flavor to the world, have the NPCs feel like real people. That's sort of another big struggle, slight tangent from when I gather information with players. I just sort of give them what they find sometimes. A chunk of the time, I'll turn it into a roleplay encounter, but the time I realized that I could have two different NPCs that they're talking to and they can argue with each other over who gets what information really sort of elevated it a lot more. And it allowed the players to now realize that they're not getting perfect information. It's a process. And this isn't perfect. It's also not going to fit for every single group, and I want to make that clear. Every group has their own play styles. Some are going to focus more on the combat and the game aspect of tabletop RPGs, and others are going to focus more on the story. Uh, my tables in particular, I really like to find a balance between challenging combat as well as a really strong story that allows the characters and players to interact with it as much as they want. And oftentimes, they'll go further than I expect them to interacting with the story, but having those options is important in my opinion. The last thing I want to do when I'm a GM is when my players first arrive somewhere or I'm setting a new scene, I have to take a minute or two to come up with names and descriptions of people, and that takes the players out of what they're experiencing. Being able to directly state the scene, even if I'm improving it, just by drawing on those descriptions and names, helps out immensely with what I'm trying to do. So, what are some of my other options? Pretty similarly to having that backlog of characters and names, is a sort of backlog. I wouldn't even say backlog though, just pre prepping shops and buildings for each town and city. And this is going to depend on what sort of setting you're playing in. If it's one where your players are traveling a lot, this will be great. If they aren't traveling and it's mostly remaining in and around a single city, it might not be as important of prep to do. But I really like to create specific shops for each new town or city that my players might be building or visiting, sorry. And I choose these a session or two before I expect them to reach a new place. Uh, Shopping RP might not be a thing for your group. I still think it's really great to be able to name and describe the shops that players are visiting. It helps to flesh out the world, even if they're not going to engage in an active conversation with these shopkeepers. It helps to make the world feel more alive to them. Instead of just going to the blacksmith, they're going to the Heart Forge, owned by Humbert Ironheart. Um, and if they want to talk with him, great. You can maybe give a little quest. Maybe it's his family heirloom forge, and some local ruffians have been trying to extort him for money recently, and he asks you for help. Otherwise, he can just talk about the history of it if he really wants to. Um, this is my more sort of active prep, creating a backlog of characters I just sort of do in the background whenever I'm bored. And since I've been GMing for a long time, I have a long list of characters that I've made with descriptions that fit them, so I can just pick that up whenever I want over time. But building buildings is something I do a lot more actively when I'm running games. I will sit down and decide a few specific buildings I'm going to plan. The main ones are typically going to be a tavern or inn, a blacksmith shop, potentially a carpenter. That's actually not very commonly gone to. An herbalist or alchemist, and one or two others. I really enjoy having a bathhouse here and there, especially after travel. That can be a really great thing that characters won't necessarily think of that they want to go to, but if you mention there being a nice bathhouse in the city, a lot of times players will then perk up and go, "Ooh, let's go visit the bathhouse." It's great to sort of wash off the dust of the road and take a break. Um, so, as the GM, giving those options to your players that they wouldn't have necessarily thought of will still help the world feel more fleshed out. And then when my players ask for a building that I don't have planned, which does still happen, I typically make sure to plan that one every city from there on. A big one I never thought my players would have wanted was a clothier. Who wants to go clothes shopping in their tabletop RPG? Apparently, my players do. So after the first time they wanted that, every new town they go to, I design a clothier as well as a shop. And at the end of the day, I'm still only building like 5 or 6 shops per place they go to. It's not much, it doesn't take very long, but it helps the world feel more fleshed out. And the best part of this, if they decide not to go somewhere that you have set up for your town, your players arrive, they do the main quest that's there, or they're just passing through, all those buildings you designed for that town that they didn't go and visit, you've already got for your next city. You can just use them instead, and your players will never know. If they decide to then go back to that town layer, well, you can either create a new set of buildings as necessary, or you could even do a branch shop from the place in the city that they were just at. They went to, let's say, Veil Weaver's Clothier is the store you created in Town A. They visited, they didn't go clothes shopping, but they went to the city next. They went to City B, and they want to go clothes shopping there. Well, you can just take Veil Weaver's Clothier and say, well, in City B is now the main branch of Veil Weavers, but it's a well-known enough shop that there's a sub shop back in Town A. And so you can just quickly reuse those building names at the very least, and you won't have to reuse the description unless they then go back to Town A, decide they want to go to Veil Weavers there. Then you might want to pull up another description, but at the very least, the names you can keep, and that'll save you on time in the long run. So doing that little bit of prep in advance for the first few towns is going to eventually stack up. And if you want a little secret, if you're running multiple campaigns with different players, they're never going to know if you use the same buildings between them. I do it all the time. If I design Ironheart Forge works, then my players in one campaign go visit it. My players in another campaign in a completely different location want a forge. Oh, I've got Ironheart Forge works already built. Let's just plug that into that city where they are, and boom, they're set. So those are my two, as a GM, main ways of prepping to really make the setting more fleshed out and immersive for your players. Having these notes up in advance can really help shave down the time you have to spend thinking of a new place or name or description for your players when they want to talk to people or go somewhere. Personally, that used to be something I really struggled with, and I think I mentioned that. When my players wanted to go somewhere, if I didn't have a building prepared, I'd have to spend a minute or two thinking it up, coming up with a name, a description, a proprietor. And while it's not the end of the world, GMs are only human as well. We all have notes we refer to, that's the point of having them. I always felt like it took away from my players' experience in the story by me having to stop and look things up. So these have been my methods of reducing the amount of times I'm doing that. I still do it on occasion. My players will oftentimes hit me with a building that I didn't even know they wanted. Recently, they visited a new town. I had a tavern built that was a sort of upscale tavern because they were pretty wealthy individuals. But when they were going to start gathering information, they specifically wanted more of a dive bar that they could go to where the less savory people perhaps would visit, or at least the not upper class individuals in town would visit. And I had to create that up on the fly because I hadn't prepared that. But you know what I will be preparing in every town and city going forward? That sort of same dive bar, because I know now that's something they might be looking for. My last piece of advice is a type of prep you can actually do with your players at the beginning of a campaign, and it's one of my favorite things to do. And this one is more for if it is a campaign that's going to take place in a more contained area. Let's say a campaign where you're going to be in a main city and its surrounding regions is where this will really shine the best. But asking your players to create NPCs for that location themselves. Most specifically, the way I do it is when there's a specific city or location that's going to be the main locale of the campaign, I ask my players to come up with two NPCs that their character already knows. It can be really awkward for players if their characters have been in a city and lived there for years, but aside from important NPCs to the story, and maybe a few shopkeepers you've come up with, there isn't anyone that they can directly refer to their backstory aside from like family or a few friends and say that they know. It can end up being a bit disconcerting where there's that sort of disconnect. realistically, if they've lived in that city for years, there should be a number of people they know and can call on. And there's a couple ways you can solve this. For me, my favorite way to do that is including my players in that creation process at the beginning of the campaign. Ask them to come up with two characters that they know. They don't have to give you much, just the name of the character, what they do, and how the player character knows this character. And you'll have instantly NPCs you can use to flesh out the world, and then the players can be a bit more active when they want to do things and directly have people they know they want to go talk to. If they want to go shopping and your player gave a merchant, they can say, "Hey, let's directly go to this merchant. I've known them for a long time. Maybe they'll give me a discount." And you can use that to just make your world feel more real to them. Let's say you've got a 4-person game. You have each person to give you 2 NPCs. Boom, you've already got 8 NPCs now, fleshing out your world that you really didn't have to do much with. And if there's one thing I've known from doing this a couple times, your players will come up with wildly different NPCs. I typically ask it not be family, since family members are likely going to be in the backstory as is. And because of that, people have come to me with merchants, teachers, priests, students they've taught, rivals, friends thought dead for a long time. It can give you a lot to really work with and make the plot and location feel a lot more at home. If you want to go a lot further with this, which I enjoy doing, is let's say you're running a pre-written campaign or already have a plan for the campaign. If you have a way that with a little bit of changing, you can take one of those NPCs that's plot relevant and change it with an NPC that a player has given from their backstory that they know, it just ups how important the story and plot is so much more because it connects them directly. And that can really help improve your story in a way that it might not have had the opportunity to do before that. So that's my favorite thing to do when running a game, especially in a small location. You can do it for a larger location if they're going to be traveling around. Still ask them to come up with an NPC or two that they know. It's going to require more effort on your part to fit them into the story, but you're the GM, and if your players really want that great storytelling experience and you're willing to put in that effort, it's going to make your campaign so much better. At the end of the day, though, how immersive and how story driven your campaign is completely up to you and your players. For those of you, though, who struggle like I did in describing what the scene feels like, creating empty feeling words entirely on accident, frequently needing to consult your notes or improv entire locations on the fly for your players, I hope this advice was of use to you. I know a lot of it boils down to just doing additional prep work, but the more you write in advance for a story, just when you have inspiration or free time, the better your storytelling and really even your ability to improv as necessary will become. If you've got a backlog of buildings or characters, when your players hit you needing something that you don't already have, you're going to have that experience of creating them already that your brain will probably be able to come up with them a bit faster than you used to. So, thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Worlds Unwritten. If you have any ideas of your own, how to make your worlds more immersive, your stories more story told, please leave them down in the comments. I myself am always looking for additional advice, even so I will be happy to read them. It'll be great for other people to read them and get that advice as well. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for watching.